My grandparents chose my cousin over me. They only saw me as a backup until I rejected their life plan. Now they want to pretend we're a happy family. My grandparents chose my cousin over me, and I reckon I was just their fallback option until I turned down the path they'd mapped out for my life. Now they're acting like we're all one big happy bunch. I'm 31 years old, a guy who spent every day of his life under their roof. My mom and dad died when I was real young, so my grandparents took me in and made me theirs legally. Being an only kid, I figure I'd have ended up in some foster home if they hadn't stepped up. I've always been thankful for that, no question. They gave up a lot to raise me, and I see that clear as day. They were already getting on in years when I came along, and chasing after a little tyke wasn't no picnic for them, but they did it anyway. They laid down some strict rules, sure, but I ain't got much room to gripe about it. Truth is, I owe them everything. Without them jumping in to look after me, I don't even know where I'd be today. I don't have many memories of my folks, but I bet seeing me every day brought my parents to their minds, which couldn't have been easy on them. They treated me like I was their own son, no doubt about that, but they also had this habit of trying to steer my whole life. I ain't sure if that's just how they thought raising a kid ought to be, or if it was something deeper, but they always figured they knew what was best for me. Back when I was little, they'd decide what I ate, picking out food they reckoned was good for me. They'd dress me up in clothes they thought suited me just fine. I never got a say in any of it, not once. Growing up, I had all these wants and wishes, but they'd shut them down quick, like my thoughts didn't count for nothing. I didn't even bother pushing back, 'cause I was scared stiff they'd toss me out or something, leaving me with no family at all. They weren't the warmest folks you'd ever meet, that's for sure. I was always a little on edge, thinking they might wake up one day and decide they didn't want me around no more. They didn't treat me bad or nothing like that, it was more like they didn't care one way or the other. I figure it's just how their generation was raised, not big on showing feelings and all. They wanted to bring me up right, and to them, that meant I'd listen to every word they said, no backtalk allowed. If I ever disagreed, they'd get all fired up, so I just went along with it. I stuck to that plan all the way through my younger years, right up till high school. I figured they had more know-how than me, so I let them call the shots on every choice I made. I'd watch my cousins running around with cool toys and wearing them superhero shirts, and yeah, I'd get jealous as all get out. But I'd tell myself my grandparents had it figured out, and if they weren't getting me that stuff, it was probably for my own good. It didn't hit me that something might be off with how they raised me till I got older and started seeing things for myself. They'd been running my life like it was their show from day one, and I couldn't tell if they meant to do it or if that's just how they were built. Maybe it's an old school thing, but they got real used to telling me what I could and couldn't do, like it was second nature to them. When I was a kid, it didn't bother me much, but as I grew into my own, it started rubbing me the wrong way, having to follow their every order. Even so, I kept at it, hating myself for bending over backwards all the time. I did whatever they told me to do, 'cause deep down, I was terrified of winding up on my own. That's how it went for years, and next thing I knew, I was sitting there filling out college applications. I'd always had my heart set on an art school, but wouldn't you know it, my grandparents had a whole different idea. They didn't sit me down to talk it out or nothing, they just flat out told me I was gonna study what they picked for me. That's when all the anger I'd been holding in just blew up. I'd been sitting on it so long, it even caught me off guard when I finally pushed back. They were just as shocked as I was. I'd never told them no before. But I had to take the wheel of my own life right then and there. If I'd caved in that moment, I'd never have let myself live it down. They were dead set on me studying economics, but I didn't give a lick about it. I tried explaining I was good at art, real good, but they wouldn't hear it. My teachers always said I had a shot at making it big in the art world. I had that kind of talent, but it didn't matter to my grandparents unless it fit their picture of what I ought to be. After I went ahead and sent off my college forms my way, they started acting cold, keeping me at arm's length. They wanted me to feel like I'd messed up big time, and they pretty much froze me out through the end of high school. It tore me up inside. They were the only parents I'd ever known, and they just dropped me like I didn't mean a thing. They didn't even show up to my graduation. I was standing there all by myself, watching every other kid with their folks cheering them on. That's the day it hit me, they weren't my real parents, no matter how much I'd built them up in my head. If they'd cared like I thought they did, they'd have swallowed their pride and been there for me. The more I chewed on it, the plainer it got. I was more like a job to them, something they wanted to shape just right and keep in line. They'd be kind enough when I played by their rules, but the second I stepped out on my own, they were gone. It was a hard pill to swallow, realizing they didn't care about me the way I cared about them. My feelings for them didn't come with strings, but theirs sure did. They stopped talking to me after graduation, didn't say a word when I headed off to college, and kept quiet in the days after. I got used to it eventually. I mean, I was basically an orphan anyway, so it wasn't too wild to think I'd end up without a family. Still, it stung something fierce to face that truth after spending my whole life looking up to them for giving me a home and pulling me out of a bad spot. After I headed off to college, my grandparents didn't bother reaching out, not a single call or letter. I'd still see them sometimes, though, 'cause my aunts and uncles kept inviting me to family get-togethers. They didn't have any problem with me or the college I picked. To them, I was just another part of the crew. So, they'd ask me over for dinners and such, and I'd go. My grandparents weren't too happy I was there, but they didn't make a fuss about it either. Most times, they'd act like I wasn't even in the room, or maybe they'd toss out a couple words like we were strangers passing on the street. I'd hang out with my cousins instead and slip out early. I didn't want to stick around long enough for things to get awkward with that tension hanging between me and my grandparents. That's how it went all through college and even after I graduated. When I landed my first big job, I picked up the phone and told them about it, but they didn't sound impressed or glad for me. I'd been working odd jobs since high school, but this was different, a solid, high-paying gig as an art consultant. I'd earned it after college, and it felt like a real win, something to be proud of. But after talking to them, I just felt down, lower than ever. I'd been holding on to this little spark of hope, thinking maybe if I did well enough, made good money or built a name for myself, they'd come around and accept me. Turns out, I was dead wrong. They didn't give a hoot about what I'd done, all 'cause I'd picked my own school instead of following their orders. That phone call snuffed out any hope I had left. I knew then there wasn't nothing I could do to change their minds or win them over. I stopped dialing their number after that. I could tell they didn't want me around, and they sure didn't reach out on their own either. Months went by, maybe longer, without a word from them until one day, my grandmother's voice came through the line. She told me to come by the house. At first, I thought maybe they were ready to patch things up, and that idea stirred up mixed feelings. Part of me wanted them back in my life, but another part was enjoying how calm everything felt without them around. I even felt a little guilty for thinking that way. When I showed up at their place, though, it wasn't just them waiting, everybody in the family was there. It was one of those big gatherings, and they'd called me in after all that time, so I figured something was up. Once we were all together, my grandparents stood up and said they were laying out their will for us. I knew they were old, but hearing them talk about getting ready for the end still hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I listened close, expecting I wouldn't get much from them except the house. That's all I cared about anyway. That house meant something to me more than just a building. It's where I'd grown up, and I was tied to it deep down. My aunts and uncles all had their own places, so I was pretty sure the house would come to me. My grandparents knew how much I wanted it. They'd even told me a few times when I was younger that it'd be mine someday. But when they got to that part of the will, they threw me for a loop. They handed the house over to my cousin instead. I just stood there, stunned, not knowing what to say. My cousins were staring at me too, they all knew I'd been counting on that house. When I finally found my voice, I asked them what was going on. They said plain as day that they wanted their oldest grandchild to have it, and that was my cousin. I reminded them they'd promised it to me, told them how much it meant, the only home I'd ever had. My parents' old stuff was still up in the attic. My mom had picked out the dining room furniture herself. That house held every scrap of memory I had of them, even if I barely knew them, and all the good times with my grandparents before everything fell apart. I said I needed it, but they just told me their minds were made up. I begged them to reconsider, and that's when they let me have it. They said I could have had the house if I'd done what they told me and picked a proper life, something they could brag about. They told me I'd embarrassed them, made them look foolish, and that meant I didn't deserve a single thing they owned. To me, that house was never just theirs, it was ours, a shared piece of my life. But right then, it clicked, they weren't giving it to my cousin 'cause he was the oldest. That was just an excuse. They were punishing me for chasing my own dreams instead of living the ones they'd drawn up. I lost a ton of respect for them in that moment. I'd always figured maybe they weren't cut out to raise me right 'cause of how old they were, but that day, I started wondering if they were even good folks at all. I walked out without another word, what else was there to say? In the days after, the hurt turned into a slow burn of anger. If they couldn't give me this one thing I'd always wanted, maybe I didn't need them in my life no more. They seemed fine cutting me off, so I decided I'd better let go too and quit fooling myself that they were something they weren't. My grandparents had made it crystal clear they didn't want me around, and I was starting to see they only existed perfect like in my head. The one thread still tying me to them was the fact I'd been covering their bills for a few years, everything from groceries to water, electric, and even their medicines. I had it all set up so stuff got dropped off at their door without them lifting a finger. They never brought it up with me, though. I reckon they thought one of my uncles was handling it or something. Didn't matter why, I couldn't keep doing it. Staying tangled up with them was tearing me apart inside, messing with my head something fierce. They weren't doing me any good, so I pulled the plug on all those payments. It was my first real step to cutting them loose for good. It took them 18 days to figure out I'd been the one footing the bill. I thought they'd call to hash it out, but when my phone rang and I answered, they were talking all sweet and polite like. Threw me off at first. Then they started saying we ought to be a family again, that they couldn't stand me being gone. Didn't take me half a minute to catch on, they just wanted me to start paying for stuff again. No way were they missing me for real, their pride was too big to let that happen. I told them straight up I'd rather not play family with them no more and hung up the line. Part of me wondered if I should have heard them out first instead of jumping to conclusions about the money. Was I too quick to judge? A few days passed after that call, and I couldn't stop second-guessing myself. Maybe they weren't after the cash, maybe they honest to God wanted me back in their lives. They didn't try ringing me again for weeks, though, and I was still steamed about them handing the house to my cousin just 'cause I'd taken my own road. Crazy thing is, I still felt like helping them out with their bills, even after all they'd done. They'd kicked me aside, and here I was, worrying they might be hurting 'cause I'd stopped pitching in. My grandfather had a decent pension from his working days, so it's not like they were broke, but I kept thinking I should be there for them now that they're old. When they didn't reach out for a while, I started mulling over calling them myself, maybe saying sorry. I didn't even know what I'd be apologizing for, but it was eating at me, keeping me up nights, thinking I'd ruined whatever we had left. I didn't make that call, though. About a month later, my grandmother got a hold of me instead. Soon as I picked up, she laid into me, calling me heartless and selfish, stuff she'd never said before. Her words were cold and sharp, and they hit me hard enough to bring tears right then and there. I asked what I'd done wrong, and she just laughed, bitter-like, saying I'd cut off their bills 'cause they didn't give me the house. I told her I was sorry, offered to start paying again if that's what they wanted. She snapped back that they didn't need a dime from me, she was just calling to tell me how ungrateful I was, how they'd failed raising me right. She kept going, piling on the hurtful stuff, and I just sat there taking it, crying like a fool. I'd never felt so alone as I did right then. A couple months went by after that mess with my grandmother, and I was in a bad way, near about depressed, if I'm honest. My buddies kept telling me to try talking to somebody, like a therapist, but I'd been brushing it off. After 8 weeks of feeling sorry for myself, I finally gave in and went. Turned out to be a good move. It opened my eyes to stuff I'd been doing my whole life without even knowing it. The therapist said I'd been hanging on to my grandparents 'cause I felt like I owed them big time. She hit the nail on the head, I did feel that way. I thought I owed them my whole existence, so I kept running back to them, even when they were tearing me down inside. She told me it wasn't my fault, that kids ain't supposed to feel indebted to the folks who raised them. That flipped a switch in my head. I started seeing it all different. I hadn't done what I did for them out of love when I was little, it was fear, plain and simple, fear they'd ditch me if I didn't toe the line. Then, when I got older, I kept at it to pay them back for taking me in, like it was some debt I had to settle. It hurt like hell to realize I didn't mean much to them after all. I'd spent my life looking up to them, thinking they'd saved me and made me who I am, but truth is, they're the ones who messed me up. I was always unsure of myself, desperate for somebody to stick by me, begging folks not to walk away, all 'cause they'd planted those fears in me deep. They weren't good to me as parents, and when I finally saw that after all those years, they turned around and punished me for it. After figuring out how much my grandparents had messed with my head, I finally worked up the guts to face them. They'd been a big shadow over my life, even when they weren't around in person. I doubt they'd say the same about me. I decided I needed to talk to them straight up, face to face, not just over the phone. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were still asking me to come to family get-togethers, but I hadn't shown up to one since that day they laid out their will. They'd been checking in on me, worried, and I appreciated that they didn't pick sides. They could have easily turned their backs on me and stuck with my grandparents, but it meant a lot that they still cared. So, when my aunt called me up for the next gathering, I said I'd go. Walking in there surprised everybody. I hadn't been around in a while. My grandparents, though, they looked like they'd seen a ghost. Probably figured they were done with me for good. Truth is, I didn't want to see them either, but I needed to settle things once and for all. I couldn't move on without looking them in the eye and telling them what they'd done to me. They had to know they weren't perfect and see the mess they'd made. I told the family I wasn't staying long, just wanted a word with my grandparents. They didn't want to step aside for a private talk, though. They told me to say what I had to right there in front of everybody. So, that's what I did. I laid it out plain. I told them they'd been lousy at taking care of me. They made me feel like I wasn't worth a damn, always on edge that they'd kick me to the curb if I didn't do exactly what they said. They drilled it into me that I owed them everything just for giving me a roof over my head. They sat there listening for a bit, real quiet, and then they let loose. They shot back that I did owe them, that without them, I'd have been some nobody orphan out on the streets. They said I ought to be thanking my lucky stars they took me in instead of leaving me to fend for myself. The way they talked was ugly, so harsh it got a couple of my aunts crying. They went on about how they'd given me their all, and I'd still gone and turned my back on them. Said they had big plans for me, and I'd thrown them away like some ungrateful punk. My cousins couldn't take it no more and jumped in, telling them to pipe down. I was too stunned to say much at first. I didn't expect them to come at me that hard. But my cousins had my back, and when I could speak again, I told my grandparents flat out they didn't mean nothing to me anymore. Whatever they called love wasn't real, it came with too many strings attached. They couldn't run my whole life and think I'd just nod along like it was fine. They didn't have nothing to say after that, so I spilled everything I'd been holding in and walked out, swearing I'd never lay eyes on them again. A few months later, I pretty much shut myself off from the world after that blowout. Kept true to my word, I didn't reach out, and I wasn't planning to, ever. My aunts, uncles, and cousins kept calling and texting, so I'd shoot them a quick message to say I was alright, just needing space. Took me 8 solid weeks before I agreed to hang out with my cousins. They'd been hounding me to come spend time with them, saying they were done talking to our grandparents after what they'd said and done. I was thankful they stood by me. When I finally went out with them, it felt good, real good, to be around family who didn't want nothing from me. They just liked having me there, no catches, and that was new to me. I'm still getting the hang of it, learning to trust they won't turn around and use me somehow. My oldest cousin pulled me aside and said the house was mine if I wanted it, but I turned him down. I hired some movers to grab my parents' old stuff from the attic, but that house? I didn't want it no more. Thinking it over, it's tied up with too many bad memories now. My grandparents weren't the mom and dad I'd wanted them to be, no matter how bad I'd wished it. They just weren't, and holding on to that place would only keep dragging me back to them. I didn't need that. For the first time, I was actually happy without them in my life. My therapist noticed it too, said she could see a real change in me and was glad I was doing better. Every day, I'm shaking off the weight they put on me, breaking free from all the hold they had over me for so long.